Hello, young soul. I never paid much attention when my friend Lucas talked about his sister's sleep problems. I thought it was just a dramatic way to describe nightmares or insomnia, something normal. But the last time we met, he told me a story that made me change my mind. A story that still makes me look into the dark corners of my room before sleeping. His sister, Clara, had always experienced episodes of sleep paralysis. If you don't know what that is, imagine waking up and being unable to move, as if trapped inside your own body. Your eyes are open, you see the room around you, but something feels wrong. A presence. A shadow standing there, watching, waiting. But the worst part isn't seeing it. The worst part is feeling that it sees you back. Clara had been dealing with this since her teenage years. Shadowy figures, shapes in the corner of the room, the sensation that something loomed over her. But as terrifying as it was, nothing had ever touched her. Until that night. It was a stifling midnight. The fan lazily spun in the corner of the room, but the heat still made sleep heavy, almost suffocating. She was sleeping on her side, turned away from the door, when she felt the familiar weight of paralysis. First came the chill down her spine, then the awareness that she couldn't move. The room felt different, darker than it should be. Then she felt it. Fingers. Not a distant presence. Not a motionless shape in the corner, but cold, bony fingers wrapping around her neck. She tried to scream, but her mouth wouldn't respond. She tried to thrash, but her muscles were locked. All she could do was feel the touch. The cold skin, fingers tightening slowly, testing her resistance. The icy breath blowing in her ear. And then something happened. For a second, she felt as if her vision was failing, as if she was seeing through someone else's eyes. But it wasn't someone else. It was that. She saw herself, lying in bed, vulnerable, with a terrified expression. She saw her own skin turning purple under the pressure of the invisible fingers. But what terrified her the most was what she felt. Satisfaction. The thing enjoyed it. And then, as suddenly as it started, it ended. The grip vanished. The room returned to normal. The clock read 3:33. Clara gasped, sitting up quickly, bringing her hands to her neck. Her skin was burning. She ran to the mirror and saw purple marks, finger impressions around her throat. It had touched her, and it had left a mark. The next morning, Clara showed the marks to Lucas, and he took a picture. He showed me the image when he told me the story. The scariest part? The bruises weren't random. They looked like human hands, but the fingers were too long, and there were more than 2 hands there. Lucas showed me the photo of the marks on his sister's neck. I wanted to say it was some kind of allergy, that she might have hurt herself while sleeping, but I knew I was lying to myself. The bruises were very well defined. They were fingers, but not human fingers. They were too long, with joints that seemed twisted at impossible angles. What bothered me the most wasn't the image itself. It was Lucas's expression when he showed me. He looked different. Pale, with deep dark circles, as if he hadn't slept for nights. "This wasn't a dream, man," he said, his voice hoarse. "It wasn't a damn dream." Clara didn't want to talk about what happened that night. In the following days, she started acting strangely. She avoided sleeping in her own room, stayed awake until dawn, and when she finally slept, it was on the couch, with the TV light on. But even then, something was still happening to her. On the second night after the attack, Lucas heard noises coming from her room. He said it was as if something was dragging across the floor. Not footsteps. Something crawling. He went in and found Clara sitting on the bed, wide-eyed, staring at the door. "Did you hear?" she whispered. Lucas shook his head, but felt a chill creeping up his neck. Her room had a strange smell. A damp, rotten odor like wet earth mixed with something sweet and sickly. "What is it?" he asked. She took a moment to respond. "They are whispering." Lucas froze. "Who?" She turned her face to him slowly, as if afraid of making sudden movements. "The hands." He said that was enough to make him leave the room. But the next night, something even worse happened. Clara finally succumbed to exhaustion and slept on the couch. Lucas was in his own room. When he heard the sound of static from the TV, he stepped out to see what had happened and found Clara asleep. The TV was on, but the screen only showed white noise, that disturbing crackling sound. He reached for the remote to turn it off, but stopped mid-motion. The screen was not just showing static. There was something there. In the midst of the black and white noise, shadows moved. Twisted shapes, resembling thin tentacles, coiled and uncoiled. For a moment, he saw something that looked like a face. No eyes. Just a black hole where a mouth should be, contorting as if it wanted to speak. And then, the sound of the static changed. It was no longer random noise. It was a whisper. At first, Lucas couldn't understand, but as he listened closely, he realized there wasn't just one. There were several. Whispering at the same time, too fast to distinguish the words. He turned off the TV at that instant. But the crackling didn't stop. The sound continued, and it was coming from the couch. He looked at Clara, and she was still asleep. But her lips were moving, as if she was speaking in the same tone as the whispers. Lucas tried to wake her, shaking her shoulders, but when she opened her eyes, it didn't look like she was seeing her brother. She looked through him, and then whispered something. 3 words. Lucas doesn't want to tell me what she said. He only mentioned that, at that moment, something made him feel a fear he had never experienced in his life. He picked Clara up in his arms and took her back to her room. But when he laid his sister on the bed and covered her, he felt something cold in his hand. He looked down. There was a mark on his skin. A handprint. What happened after that night, I can't say for sure. When Lucas told me, he seemed more like a shadow of himself. His eyes were deeper, and his once strong voice was almost inaudible. He had been silent for hours, sitting in that dark room, staring at his own hands, as if he could still feel the icy touch of what had marked his skin. I couldn't understand the fear within him until he shared what happened in the following days. On the night he felt the mark on his hand, he couldn't sleep. Neither could Clara. The fear, the discomfort, the feeling that something was lurking, wouldn't let them be at peace. But what tormented them the most was that with each passing day, the sensation of presence grew stronger. As if someone, or something, was waiting for a slip, a mistake, to draw closer again. Lucas tried to get Clara to seek help, but she refused. She was convinced that what was happening to her wasn't a mental illness, it wasn't just a sleep disorder. "They are coming to get me," she would say. "I saw the fingers. I saw the hands. They won't stop." But on the second night after the mark, something even worse happened. Lucas woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something dragging in the hallway. It was a sound so low it could be mistaken for the whisper of the wind. But he knew it wasn't the wind. It was something heavier, something more real. He got out of bed, tense, and left the room. The hallway was dark, with a single light on at the end, casting shadows on the walls. He walked slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. When he got near the living room, he stopped. The door was ajar. But what he saw when he opened it couldn't be explained. Clara was in the center of the room, eyes closed, head tilted back. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out. It was as if she were in a trance. Her hands were stretched out to the sides, fingers twisted in an impossible way, as if trying to reach something but failing. And even more terrifying was that, looking at her hands, he saw the same pattern of marks that she had on her neck. A set of thin, elongated fingers, with skin distorted, as if someone had twisted them in a way no human could. Lucas called her name, but Clara didn't respond. She didn't move. As he approached, he felt the temperature in the room drop sharply. A cold breeze passed through him, as if the room itself were breathing. And then he heard the whispers. But they weren't the same whispers as before. Now the voices were clearer, closer, as if they were inside his head. Each word sounded heavy, cruel, and full of malice. He tried to push the feeling away, but something inside him compelled him to look into Clara's eyes. When he did, he saw that she was no longer there. Her eyes were completely white, without irises, without pupils, as if her soul had been ripped away. But the worst part wasn't the eyes. The worst part was what he saw in the shadows behind her. Shapes. Hands. But they weren't human hands. They were monstrous, with fingers too long, so thin and twisted they seemed more like tentacles than human limbs. The shadows writhed on the wall, the fingers extending towards Clara. touching her with a terrifying gentleness. And soon after, the hands began to push her. Lucas tried to scream, tried to run to her, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as if the ground had glued to the soles of his shoes. He was trapped, powerless, watching his sister being slowly dragged into the darkness. With each passing second, the shadows seemed to spread further, enveloping Clara, pulling her into what looked like an abyss of darkness. And then, when the hands began to disappear into the dark, Lucas saw what unsettled him the most. Clara, with a completely empty face, murmured one last word. "They will come." That night, Clara did not wake up. Lucas tried everything to bring her back, but what he found was no longer his sister. It was as if she were an empty shell, lifeless, soulless. Her skin was cold to the touch, her eyes white and lifeless, and the smell of the house had changed. Now, there was a stench of decay, of rotting flesh. Desperate, Lucas sought help, but no one believed him. No one wanted to believe. Who could? How could he explain what he was saying? He knew what he saw, but no one else could see. In the following days, the whispers never stopped. They followed him, night after night, whispering in his ears, saying words he didn't understand. The shadows appeared where he least expected them. And each night, more and more marks appeared on his body. And what panicked him more than anything else was that he began to see the hands too. Not in shadows, not on the walls, but on people. The marks on the back of his hand were spreading. His fingers were twisting, elongating. He tried to hide it from everyone, but there was no way to conceal the truth. He could feel the cold fingers touching his skin, squeezing slowly. With each night, more and more fingers. And then, Lucas disappeared. That morning, when the police arrived at the house, they found nothing. There were no signs of a struggle, nothing to suggest he had left forcefully. Just a photo on his cell phone. A photo of his own face, with completely white eyes, and a visible hand in the background of the image. The whispers are now more intense, closer. And I know what comes next. I know they are coming for me too. I had known something was wrong since Lucas disappeared. The entire town felt the void, but no one truly knew what was happening in those houses, in the walls, in the dark hallways. No one knew about the whispers. What I didn't know, what no one knew, was that the evil, the thing that devoured everything around it, was growing. The whispers never stopped. They were everywhere now, in the corners of my mind, in the shadows that dragged along the street. Every night, I felt a presence, as if something was watching me, waiting for me. I didn't want to believe what happened to Lucas. He had disappeared, yes, but I still held a foolish hope that he would return. That he would be okay, somewhere, hiding from it all. From all the evil. But then, I went to his house. It was a gray morning, the sky covered with heavy clouds that seemed to promise something terrible. I entered, my heart racing in my chest, each step echoing in the silence of the empty house. I knew I shouldn't, but something urged me to search for answers. The house was intact, but the smell of rotting flesh was stronger, more oppressive. I followed to Lucas's room, where he had vanished. The air was heavy, almost sticky, as if the room itself was absorbing the pain and fear that had been left behind. That's when I saw it. The photo. It was on the bedside table, next to a cell phone that didn't belong to Lucas. It was a photo of his own face, but distorted, with his eyes completely white and lifeless, and the hand visible in the background of the image, was not his. It was larger, too long, with fingers stretched out, almost writhing, reaching close to his face, touching him with a chilling gentleness. I didn't want to look, but I was unable to look away. That hand was not human. The fingers were too thin, too long, and each was deformed in a way I couldn't comprehend. As if the very flesh was warping, transforming, as if reality was breaking around it. I touched the screen of the cell phone with my fingertips. The background of the photo began to move. The shadows on the wall started to stretch, elongate, until they seemed to cover the entire room. I took a step back, fear paralyzing me. I could see the hands now. They were in every corner, crawling along the walls, as if they were preparing to reach me. As if they already knew I was there. And then the sound came. Whispers. They were no longer scattered voices. They were no longer fragments of words. Now the voices were clear, distinct. They were saying my name. They were calling me, as if I were part of it, as if I was already being pulled into the darkness. I screamed, but no one heard me. Fear consumed my body, and then a hand appeared behind me. It touched my neck, and the ice that coursed down my spine made me fall to the ground. I tried to pull away, but the weight of the presence immobilized me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. Hands were everywhere, touching, gripping, pulling. The sound of static filled the air. It was as if the house itself had come alive, feeding off the terror radiating from me. And then, I looked into the mirror. My reflection was no longer mine. I saw him. Lucas. With white eyes. With the marks on his neck. With long, thin, distorted hands, wrapped in shadows, touching my face through the glass. And it was there, in front of the mirror, that I realized. I never left that house. I never escaped the shadows. I never escaped what was in the whispers, in the hands, in the dark. I was part of it now. I looked at the phone in my hands, and I saw the picture. The picture of Lucas, with white eyes and a hand, the same hand that was behind me. And in the back of the photo, one word, come. The last breath I took was smothered by the weight of the hands, which were now mine. You know those stories that someone tells you, and you immediately feel that something is off? Not because they seem like lies, but because they seem too real. So real that they start to mess with your head, like an idea that clings to your brain and refuses to leave. That's what happened when Clara called me that night. It was late, almost midnight, when my phone vibrated. Her message was short, I need you now. I tried to call, but she didn't answer. She just sent the location of her apartment and a single audio message. When I hit play, I only heard her quickened breathing. In the background, a distant sound, like someone lightly scratching wood. I didn't think twice. I grabbed my keys and headed over. When I arrived, Clara opened the door quickly, as if she had been waiting for me. Her eyes were sunken, red, and her hands trembled. Tell me I'm going crazy. Not understanding, I asked what had happened. Instead of answering, she handed me her phone. There was a message without identification, from an unknown number. No text, just a photo. A photo of herself, sleeping. I felt a strange chill run down my spine. Who sent you this? She shook her head. I don't know. The image was dark but clear. It showed Clara lying in bed, her hair spread on the pillow, eyes closed. As if someone had stood there next to her, waiting for the right moment to take the shot. Do you have a camera in your room? No. Did someone come in here? The doors were locked. All the windows too. That's when I noticed something wrong with the photo. The angle. It seems obvious now, but at the time, my brain refused to accept it. The camera wasn't inside the room. It was outside. In the glass of the window in the back, there was a reflection. A dark silhouette standing there, watching. Clara froze when she saw it. But I live on the 4th floor. Her voice came out as a whisper. And then her phone vibrated again. Another photo. Now, the silhouette was closer. Much closer. The phone slipped from Clara's hands and hit the ground with a dull thud. Neither of us moved to pick it up. We stood there, frozen, the air heavy as if the room itself were suffocating us. The image still glowed on the phone screen, the dark silhouette now nearer, as if it had taken a step forward. Slowly, I forced myself to look at the actual window of the room. The glass reflected only the dim light of the surroundings and the weak glow of the streetlight outside. Nothing there. No shadow. No silhouette. But that didn't mean it wasn't there. This is a prank. It has to be. My voice sounded weak, without conviction. Clara shook her head. Look at the photo again. Look closely. I swallowed hard and picked up the phone from the floor. My fingers trembled as I zoomed in on the image. Now, paying closer attention, I noticed a detail that made my stomach drop. The eyes. The silhouette had no face, no features, no expression. But the eyes, they were open and shining. It wasn't a reflection of some external light. It wasn't an effect of the camera. It was as if two dark, deep fissures had opened there, empty, consuming everything around. And then, the phone vibrated again. Another photo. My heart stopped for a second. This time, it was a shot of the bedroom door. From the outside. No. No. Clara murmured, retreating to the corner of the room, her eyes wide. The photo seemed to be taken from the apartment hallway. A dark, narrow space, with walls worn by time. But what sent chills racing through my veins was the detail at the edge of the image. A long shadow. And feet. Bare, dirty feet, with grayish skin. Someone, or something, was in the hallway. Right now. The silence weighed heavily between us. A living, pulsating silence, full of meanings. I could hear my own breathing, heavy and uneven. And then came the sound. 3 slow knocks on the door. Knock. 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 My chest tightened. I knew I shouldn't look. Everything inside me screamed not to look. But I looked. The doorknob began to move. Slowly. Turning. And in the reflection of the window, I saw the eyes shining from the inside. I don't know how I managed to move. At that moment, my body felt like it had lost control. My legs were heavy, the air in the room grew thicker, and the feeling that something was about to happen filled me with unbearable anxiety. The doorknob continued to turn, slightly, as if someone was testing whether it was still locked. The sound was low, but clear enough to make me tremble. I looked at Clara, who was pressed against the wall, her expression lost, as if she didn't know what to do. She wasn't crying, but her eyes were empty, as if she had already understood that night, nothing would make sense anymore. The sound of the doorknob stopped. Silence flooded the room again. But instead of bringing me any relief, it only made me feel more lost. It was as if the absence of sound was more threatening than any noise. The world around us seemed to have frozen, waiting for something I didn't want to happen. And then the voice. I don't know where it came from. I don't know if it came from the door or if it was just an echo inside my head. I see you. I froze. I knew I shouldn't look at the window, but I couldn't look away. She was there. The silhouette. Closer now, almost completely in the reflection of the glass. But the eyes had changed. They were no longer just dark holes. Now they were like 2 glowing circles, the color of fire, of something sick, of something supernatural. The darkness around seemed to bend, to twist, as if distorting around that presence. Clara, my voice came out hoarse, almost a whisper. She didn't respond. She was paralyzed, her breathing light and uneven. And then, her phone vibrated again. I knew what it was before I even looked. Another picture. I hesitated for a second, trying to ignore the feeling that something very wrong was about to happen. When I finally looked, my throat tightened. The image showed a different room. It wasn't her bedroom. It was a dark, dirty hallway, with the floor covered in dust. In the background, among the shadows, an ajar door. And in the crack of the door, I saw a hand. Not a human hand. It was something distorted. The skin, pale and wrinkled, seemed to stretch unnaturally. The fingers were thin, much longer than they should be, and were curled, as if waiting to grasp something. But the most disturbing part was the color. It was the same color as the eyes in the window, a cold, sickly glow, as if the hand were made of something no longer human. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come out. I was frozen in fear. Suddenly, the door swung open completely. The thing was no longer just watching. Now, it was inside. Clara began to cry, but it wasn't a normal cry. It was the kind of crying that comes from the deepest parts of the soul, something desperate, a silent scream that cut through the silence of the room. I didn't know what to do. There was no more time. The thing was getting closer. I could feel, more than hear, the soft steps in the hallway. As if it were slowly dragging itself, unhurried, as if it already knew that nothing could save us. And then I saw the thing The creature finally appeared in the reflection of the window. It was a tall, hunched figure, with excessively broad shoulders and impossibly elongated limbs. But what paralyzed me completely were the eyes. They were now at the window, not in the reflection. They were there, looking directly at me. And the worst part? They were smiling. Yes, smiling. It was a wide, grotesque smile that stretched across the face in a way I knew shouldn't be possible. There were no teeth. Just a smile spreading across the pale skin, like an open wound. I screamed. It was all I could do. I screamed until my throat burned. But the sound seemed to vanish into the air, as if nothing I said mattered. You found me. The voice was low, hoarse, but clear. As if it had originated from within my own mind, a thought I never asked to have. The creature did not move. It just stood there, watching me, as if waiting for me to do something. I turned to Clara. She was no longer in the corner of the room. She was at the door. She was walking towards the creature. And before I could do anything, the door closed behind her. And I was left there, alone, in the dark, waiting. Whatever it is, it won't leave me in peace anymore. The darkness engulfed the room. Everything around me seemed to crumble, as if time itself had stopped. There was no more sound, except for the noise of my own ragged breathing. The heart pounding too hard, the mind trying to process the impossible. The door had closed behind Clara, and I didn't know what was happening outside, but my instinct told me I could do nothing more. I was trapped in something beyond what any human could understand. I tried to run to the door. I tried to scream, but fear paralyzed me before I could take a step. The sensation of being watched, that something or someone was behind me, became unbearable. I glanced at the reflection in the window again. The eyes were there. Not just in the window. They were inside me, looking at me from all sides, as if I had become part of that nightmare. That's when I saw it. There was something in the reflection, at the back of the room. Something I hadn't noticed before. A dark shape, flattened against the wall, as if waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I turned, trying to avert my gaze from the glass, but when I looked to the corner of the room, what I saw made me collapse. Clara was there. Or at least it seemed to be her. But something was wrong. She stood still, eyes closed, as if asleep. But the expression was empty. The grotesque smile, that impossible smile with sharp, curved teeth, was on her face. Her skin was pale, more than before, and there was something distorted about her limbs, as if she were being consumed by a supernatural force. Her reflection in the glass didn't match her real body. She was more elongated, as if her body was stretching in an unnatural way, disfigured. Suddenly, I heard the sound of light but firm footsteps in the hallway. Dragging steps, as if someone were dragging themselves along, unhurried, endless. The bedroom door trembled slightly, as if something were on the other side, testing the limits. I knew I shouldn't look at the window. Not anymore. But I couldn't help it. The figure was there again. The distorted silhouette. The thing that had haunted every corner of that apartment. It was closer now. Closer than it had ever been. And I knew, deep in my soul, that there was no escape left. That being didn't just want to watch us. It had already marked us. I saw Clara's reflection, but now she was no longer still. She was walking toward the window, slowly, without really moving. It was as if she were being controlled by something, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Her eyes were open now, but empty, and that smile, that monstrous smile, stretched wider and wider, as if it were about to tear her face apart. She reached the window, and stopped. She looked at me, but her eyes were no longer hers. They were empty. There was nothing left there. That's when the smile widened even more, until I heard the crack of her bones. An invisible force had taken hold of her body. Clara's legs bent impossibly, as if the weight of her own body was breaking every bone. And then, she screamed. But it wasn't a human scream. It wasn't something that could be made by a living being. It was a deep, primal sound that came from the depths of the earth. Something made by a mouth that shouldn't exist. I wanted to close my eyes, but I couldn't. My body was paralyzed, unable to react. Every movement of Clara, every crack in her body, echoed in the window, in the shadows, in the distortions. as if the thing controlling her was something that couldn't be described. There were no words to explain what I was seeing. When the scream finally ceased, there was absolute silence. I fell to my knees. I could think no more, could understand nothing. I was lost in total darkness. Only the sound of my breathing and the crack of something out of place, filled the space. And then, a soft voice whispered in my ear, "You found me." I couldn't move. Panic consumed me. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I knew there was something behind me. Something waiting to take my soul. That's when I saw my own reflection in the glass. And it was smiling. It wasn't my smile. It wasn't my face. It was the same distortion, the same monstrosity, the same presence that had taken hold of Clara. I was next. And then, everything went dark. What happens when fear goes beyond what we can see? Things can happen to us without us even realizing. It was during a muggy, moonless night that Julia heard it for the first time. A slow, irregular grinding sound. A viscous, wet noise as if something was moving through the house's ceiling. She tried to ignore it. Maybe it was rats, or perhaps just the wind shifting dry leaves. But the persistence of those noises made her skin crawl. Something was up there, dragging itself across the wood, as if exploring every inch of her ceiling. She lived alone in a small house, away from the village center. An old building, with creaky boards that groaned even under the weight of her light footsteps. Her closest neighbors were a few meters away, old acquaintances who always emphasized how that house had history. Julia never paid much attention to that. Until now. The first time she mentioned the noises was to her neighbor, Mrs. Marder, a woman with wrinkled hands and a watchful gaze. It must be some opossum deer. Or maybe bats. These old houses have holes where all sorts of things get in. But you don't look well. Did you sleep right? Julia hadn't slept well for days. Every night, the moment she lay down and closed her eyes, the sound returned. Crawling, methodical, moving directly above her bed. One morning, she even climbed onto a chair to try to peek into the ceiling's opening. But the darkness inside seemed too thick, as if it swallowed any beam of light that tried to penetrate it. That night, she decided to test something. She left her phone recording, camera pointed at the ceiling. If it was just an animal, at least she could see or hear something concrete. What she found the next day made her stomach churn. The recording started off calm. Just the silence of the room. Then, around 3:37 a.m., a noise made itself known. A sticky sound, as if something was moving on its belly. But that wasn't what made her body freeze. It was the moment when, without any explanation, her phone's camera stopped recording on its own. The video simply ended abruptly. That same night, the sound intensified. Now, in addition to the dragging, there was something new. A whisper. Low, incomprehensible, as if someone were trying to speak without wanting to be heard. Julia felt her heart pounding in her chest. She grabbed her phone and sent a quick message to her neighbor, João, asking him to come over. He didn't respond immediately, but minutes later, she heard a light knock on the door. She opened it, relieved to see João there, still in his pajamas and looking sleepy. "Did you hear that?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He frowned. "What?" Julia's eyes widened. "The noises, in the ceiling." The man fell silent for a few seconds listening. But there was nothing. The silence of the house now felt almost mocking. "If you want, I can go up tomorrow morning and take a look," he offered, trying to appear calm. She nodded, with no choice. But that night would be long. When João finally left, she returned to bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The silence remained, but Julia knew something was there. Watching. Waiting. In the early morning, the noise returned. And this time, the wooden stairs leading to the attic creaked. someone, or something, was coming down. Julia didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The sounds, now clearer and closer, made her curl up in the corner of the bed. The feeling that something was watching her, moving in every corner of the house, was unbearable. She felt as if the very eyes of the house were fixed on her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The sound of the creaking wooden stairs, rising and falling, sliced through the silence with an almost palpable violence. It was not just footsteps, but something heavier, more terrifying. The sound of something, or someone, dragging, as if it were being pulled back into the attic, or as though it had descended from the darkness. She tried to resist, attempting to maintain her rationality, but she couldn't. Her body was tense, as if it instinctively knew that something was very, very wrong. Panic filled her chest when, for a fraction of a second, she heard a low, moist breath coming from above. Not a whisper or a groan, but a breath like that of a hungry animal, with something more, something sickening, that made the air thick and heavy. Julia rose from the bed, her feet touching the cold floor like ice. She could barely see through her fear, but felt an urgent need to check what was happening. With a hesitant step, she approached the door and opened it. Slowly, making the least noise possible. The hallway was dark and deserted, but something made her look up. There, on the stairs leading to the attic, the shadows were moving. They were not natural shadows. There was a distortion in their shape, as if they were twisted, moving in an unnatural way, approaching, and something was ascending. Julia couldn't comprehend what it was, but a chilling sensation took over her body, as if the air around her had become thicker. The house's light flickered once, and the moment it went out, the sound ceased. There was no more movement, just a silence so absolute it hurt her ears. Julia felt that the house was alive, breathing along with her. The air felt warmer, denser. And then, a soft, almost imperceptible knock came from the other side of the attic door. She didn't know what to do. Panic overwhelmed her. She knew something was there, but she couldn't see it. She couldn't touch it. She couldn't scream. She just stood there, frozen, her eyes fixed on that door. And then, as if it were a vision, she saw a figure peering from inside the attic. The eyes, they were deep, hollowed, like black holes. There were no pupils, only an immense and overwhelming darkness. The skin, pale and stretched, looked almost transparent, revealing the blue veins beneath, as if it were about to disintegrate at any moment. The mouth, wide open, exhaled a stench of rotting flesh, and from within it, a buzzing of flies echoed, mingling with the sound of heavy, damp breathing. The horror was indescribable. Julia didn't know whether to run or stay there, waiting. But her body, paralyzed by fear, kept her standing, facing that vision from beyond. Then, with an abrupt movement, the figure vanished. It didn't ascend to the attic, nor descend to the hallway. It simply disappeared. And as it vanished, a sound of something heavy falling, as if a body had been dropped from the height of the ceiling, made the entire house tremble. Julia could no longer control herself. Desperate, she ran to the phone, nearly breaking her fingers from pressing the keys so hard, and called the police. When the cold voice of the operator answered, she could barely articulate a sentence. She could only whisper, nearly in tears, "I need help. Something is here, in my house." Within minutes, the police cars arrived. They made their way to the house, passing through the deserted, darkened streets of the village, unhurried, as if the situation were just another routine episode. When they reached Julia's door, the officer in front, an older man, looked at her with an expression that mixed weariness and doubt. "What's going on, ma'am?" he asked, in a clinical tone. Julia, desperate, led him into the hallway. They climbed the stairs slowly. When they reached the top, the man stopped, his eyes fixed on the attic door. "You said you heard noises coming from there?" he asked, without moving. Julia simply nodded, breathing heavily and her heart racing. The officer signaled to the other policemen and, with a firm gesture, instructed them to open the door. When the attic door was unlocked, the warm, heavy air inside spread out, and a nauseating smell of rotting flesh infiltrated everyone's nostrils. What they found up there was something no one should ever have seen. In the dimness of the attic, in the depths of darkness, something was perched. It was neither human nor animal. It resembled an amalgam of parts, a twisted and contorted body, formed from limbs of different creatures. and at the center of that macabre scene, there was a thing that seemed to be waiting for them. A pair of white eyes, without pupils, shining in the darkness as if watching every movement. The leading officer approached, and as he stepped closer, he felt the air grow even denser. And then, before anyone could react, he fell. Not as if he were fainting, but as if he were being pulled into the darkness, as if something had lunged at him. The other officers screamed. The entire house seemed to vibrate. The sound of screams echoed throughout the village, but no one ever truly knew what happened that night. When the police arrived to investigate, everything was silent. The attic was empty, and the only trace of something unusual was the bloodstains on the floor. Julia was never seen again. When the officers arrived the next morning, what they found was even more macabre than they could imagine. Julia's house was completely disheveled. The room where she had been the night before was in disarray. The furniture was moved, the curtains torn, and the bed, where she supposedly had slept, was covered in something strange. The morning light, weak and timid, could not dispel the sense of oppression that hung over the house. Yet there were no signs of a struggle. There were no traces of physical conflict, as if no one had been forced to leave. The only signs of destruction seemed to come from the attic, but access to it was locked. The officer, who had been the first to enter, tried to force the door again. But this time, as he pushed it, the wood gave way strangely, as if something on the other side had moved with the door's motion. What he found up there, no one would ever be able to describe accurately. But he remembers. The smell of decay mingled with the dampness of the old attic, the sensation that the air was too thick to breathe. And deep in the densest shadows, a silhouette. Something large, but with a distorted shape, that seemed to be just waiting for him to come closer. He felt like he was being watched, but the experience that paralyzed him was not the sight, but the sound. As he approached the edge of the attic, he heard a whisper. Not words, but something like a dragged murmur, repeated incessantly, as if an ancient tongue was trying to communicate with him, begging him to understand, begging him to leave. And then, it was when he looked down at the floor. Something had been dragged there. Something heavy. When the other officers arrived on the scene, the officer who had been in front, the same one who had gone down to check the stairs, was found unconscious, with his mouth full of dirt and his hands deeply embedded in the ground, as if he had tried to hold on to something he could not see. He was in shock, unable to speak. His eyes were dull, lifeless, as if he had been pulled from his own consciousness. The worst was yet to come. During the investigation, the police found an object in the corner of the attic, something that seemed out of place. A small broken mirror, surmounted by a strange dark, viscous substance. That was not blood. The smell emanating from the substance was sweet, as if it was something organic, but at the same time sour and leaven, as if it were decomposing before their eyes. When one of the investigators approached the mirror, he noticed something. He couldn't explain what it was, but it seemed that the reflection wasn't quite right. The reflection in him didn't fully correspond to reality. There were distortions in the reflected images. He quickly stepped back, feeling panic take over, not knowing why. The terror wasn't just in the house, but within himself. The sensation that something was watching him, even in the mirror's reflection, was unbearable. The police didn't find Julia, nor her body. There were no signs of a struggle, just a broken mirror and a mystery in the attic. But the investigations began to intensify as strange reports started to emerge. Neighbors began to hear more stories. People who had passed by Julia's house, even after the police had investigated, felt a chill, as if they were being watched. Some claimed to hear driving sounds coming from the attic, even with the house seemingly empty. Others reported seeing a distorted and incomplete figure in their shadows, as if it followed them silently, always a step behind. And one night, a week later, someone looked up. It was late at night when the man, who lived 3 houses down from Julia's, heard the sound again. But it wasn't the driving sound. It wasn't the sound of something moving in the walls. He looked out the window, almost unwillingly, and saw something projecting from Julia's attic. Something large. Something that stretched out, as if it had arms that were too long. He thought he was seeing a nightmare, but when he looked again, the arms were there, reaching out from the attic window, as if trying to grasp something. The man screamed. And upon screaming, the sound stopped. The arm retracted. And Julia's house was, once again, immersed in silence. However, the worst was yet to come. The next day, he and the other neighbors went to the police to report what had happened. But when they arrived at Julia's house, they found nothing. The house was empty, devoid of furniture, with no signs of anyone having lived there. But something was wrong. The foul odor emanating from within was unmistakable. Once again, the attic seemed impenetrable. And it was there, amidst that disturbing silence, that one of the officers looked up toward the attic and was found with completely white eyes. He could no longer speak, he didn't move, he didn't react. When they finally managed to take him back to the station, he merely whispered one word, repeatedly, like a mantra: "Don't look up. Don't look up." That was the last time anyone saw or heard about Julia's house. But if you pass by there today, at night, on a moonless night, you might hear. You might feel the weight of what was left behind, waiting for someone like you, to look up. And believe me, something, or someone, will be there, watching. Months have passed since Julia's disappearance, and the incidents in her house. The village, once peaceful and isolated, now seemed a shadow of its former self. The streets were deserted, neighbors avoided looking toward the house that had, until then, been the stage of what no one would dare call an event. The echoes of a terrible night spread through the village like a disease. Those who still dared to approach felt the air heavy, stifling, and an uncomfortable sensation that something was still there, waiting. But no one spoke of what had happened anymore. No one dared to enter the house. Until one night, someone unexpected, someone unwanted, finally returned. It was a simple traveler, a solitary man, passing through the village on his way to a distant town. Without warning, he entered a street where Julia's house still stood, desolate, with broken windows and a roof slowly collapsing. He seemed unaware of the events that had surrounded the place until a visibly tense man warned him to be careful, to stay away. But the traveler, with the typical curiosity of one lost in unknown lands, ignored the warning and approached the house. That night, as he entered the yard, a strange and suffocating sensation overwhelmed him. The air felt heavy and warm, and somehow he knew that something was about to awaken. He hesitated for a moment, feeling a growing discomfort, but something was drawing him in. Something was calling. He climbed the creaking wooden steps of the porch and, as if guided by an invisible force, pushed the door. It opened with a nauseating sound, as if being forced to yield. The first thing he noticed was the absolute silence. The sound of the wind had vanished. The birds that used to sing in the trees outside were now silent. It was as if the world outside had been erased. As he crossed the threshold, the smell, that same sweet, laden, and sour odor, invaded his nostrils, making him swallow hard. He saw, at the back of the room, a shadow that seemed to move slowly. The house, which appeared empty, was, in fact, full. Not of objects or furniture, but of something much more dangerous. Something that had been waiting patiently, lurking like a predator. He walked through the rooms as the heat of the place intensified. The darkness seemed to be swallowed by darkness, forming a cycle of emptiness that absorbed him more and more. It was then that he saw it. On the stairs, something was moving. It was a figure, neither human nor animal, but something in between. His flesh appeared to have been torn and grotesquely reassembled. The face was a mass of distorted flesh. The eyes were two black holes sucking in light, and its mouth, overly open, exhaled a buzzing of flies and something more. What he saw was indescribable, as if the emptiness of the house had materialized into something alive, something hungry. And when he looked up, the shadows began to move. They were no longer shadows. They had taken shape. Silhouettes stretched from the walls, from the ceiling, as if the very shadows of the house were trying to break free. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in his throat, not coming out, not being heard. Only the sound of buzzing filled his ears, his breathing becoming more and more difficult. It was then that he understood. Julia hadn't disappeared. She had never left. She was there. And what she found in that attic was not just an entity. It was not merely a being from another dimension, or a thing that inhabited the threshold between the real and the unreal. What she encountered was a pact that had begun long before her, long before anyone. What she had unleashed was a presence, an entity that would need a sacrifice. Something more, much more, to stay alive, to feed. And when she looked up, she saw what she should not have seen. The truth about what lurked in the attic. The wanderer tried to leave, but his feet wouldn't move. He felt as if the shadows had imprisoned him. And at the back of the room, on the stairs, the distorted figure of Julia, with her wide eyes and mouth of flies, watched him. She was no longer human. Not by far. She was the resident of the house now. She was part of it, part of the emptiness that existed there. And before he could even react, she began to approach, her movements slow but deliberate. With her eyes fixed on him, she opened her mouth, and the flies poured out like an enraged swarm. And then, a scream was heard. A scream so deep, so desperate, it seemed to tear apart reality itself. But no one else would hear. The house was silent once more. The next morning, the entire village was awakened by a series of screams. The houses were empty. That stranger, the wanderer, was never found again. And the house, now, no longer seemed merely abandoned. There was something there. Something waiting. Something hiding in the shadows, something that watched, waited. And when night fell once again over the village, Julia's house was back. Not just as a house, but as an emptiness, a black hole pulling in everything nearby. Something that, once looked at, could never be forgotten. Now, the only warning left is, don't look up. For if you do, something, or someone, will be waiting for you. It was Marcos who told me this story. He was a skeptical guy, always mocking when someone talked about supernatural things. But that night, his voice trembled, and I swear I saw genuine fear in his eyes. He wasn't making anything up. Dude, this really happened. I saw it with my own eyes. I haven't slept right since then. The story he told me happened to his cousin, Carolina. She lived alone in a small apartment on the 8th floor of an old building, in the center of some city. The kind of place where the walls are too thin, and you hear whispers coming from the hallway, even when no one seems to be there. Her boyfriend, Enrique, had died a week earlier. A motorcycle accident. The impact was so strong that he died instantly. Carolina was devastated. She cried until there were no more tears, refused to leave the house, and went days without eating. That night, she was lying in bed, wrapped in a blanket, staring into nothing. The only light came from the screen of her phone on the nightstand. It was past midnight when the phone vibrated. A message. When she picked up the device, her heart stopped for a second. It was a message from Enrique. Love, open the door. She froze. The screen still glowed in her hand, his name displayed right there, impossible to ignore. For a moment, she thought it might be a mistake, a glitch in the system, maybe a clone number. But before she could process it, another message arrived. I'm out here. Open. Carolina felt a chill run down her spine. She sat up in bed, gripping her phone tightly. This made no sense. The number was the same, the profile picture was still his, a selfie taken on her last birthday. Her fingers trembled as she typed her response. This isn't funny. Who's sending these messages? Her index finger hovered over the send button, hesitant. But before she could press it, another message came. I need to get in. It's cold out here. Her heart raced. The doorbell rang. 3 short, rapid knocks. She felt her insides twist. Carolina stood there, motionless, holding her phone, listening to the overwhelming silence that came after the sound of the doorbell. Then, another message. Why won't you open for me, love? Cold sweat trickled down her forehead. Carolina gathered her courage and typed, You're dead. She didn't expect a response. But it came. Then why can I still see you from out here? She jumped out of bed, feeling her eyes fill with tears. She walked to the door with shaky steps, pressing the phone against her chest, breathing short, her whole body on high alert. She pressed her eye to the peephole. On the other side, the hallway was empty. But the doorbell rang again. And at that same moment, another message arrived. Look down. She didn't want to look. Every cell in her body screamed for her to run, to get away from there. But, as if driven by an uncontrollable force, Carolina opened the door. There was no one there. Just a cell phone lying on the floor, still sending messages. The screen lit up, showing a new notification. I thought you would miss me, love. Marcos told me that after that day, Carolina couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the sound of the doorbell seemed to echo in her mind. She began to live with a constant sense of paranoia, as if she were being watched. Even the small details of the apartment bothered her. The ticking of the clock in the living room, the sound of raindrops hitting the window, the creaking of the floorboards in the hallway. Every noise turned into a warning sign. Something was wrong. When she picked up the cell phone again, she saw that Enrique's number was still active, but the phone was off. The last text message had been sent just a few hours after she opened the door, but the worst was yet to come. She didn't reply, but the messages kept coming. I'm in your house, Carolina. You know where. And then, a new message. Look behind you. It was at that moment that things took a much darker turn. Carolina quickly turned, her eyes freezing on the reflection of the bathroom door, which was ajar. She could see, at that moment, the reflection of something that shouldn't be there. Enrique's face was reflected in the door. His eyes, hollow and lifeless, stared directly at her. Carolina's breath stopped. She tried to scream, but her throat tightened. Her feet were glued to the floor, paralyzed by terror. Enrique, with his empty, rigid expression, seemed to be slowly approaching through the reflection. The cell phone vibrated in her hand with another message. You didn't let me in. Carolina could no longer think straight. The words scrambled in her head. The vision of the reflection, with that pale and lifeless face, was so vivid and real that she felt as if Enrique himself were there, in front of her, waiting for her to make a decision. Then the doorbell rang again. This time, it wasn't just a ring. It was a continuous sound that seemed to resonate through her bones. Carolina didn't have the courage to go to the door. She felt the pressure in her chest increase, as if the air was being pulled from her lungs. With every passing second, her mind felt more fragmented. She no longer knew if what she saw was real or a hallucination, if she was still awake or already immersed in an endless nightmare. When she looked at the cell phone, a final message appeared. I'm inside. At that moment, she didn't need courage anymore. She panicked. She ran to the door and, with trembling hands, opened it completely, expecting to find something. But there was no one. The cell phone was gone from the floor. Everything was too silent. Fear paralyzed her for seconds. She looked down, where Enrique's phone had fallen before, but nothing was there. However, a very strange feeling took over her. A weight, as if the air had become too dense to breathe. Enrique's gaze followed her. She felt he was there, somewhere, waiting for the right moment to appear. Fear gripped her body in a visceral way, as if he were present in an invisible manner. Then she heard the whisper. A soft sound coming from behind her. You shouldn't have opened the door. Terror engulfed Carolina so intensely that she fell to her knees on the floor. The whisper was followed by an unbearable cold that spread through the house, leaving her completely frozen. But the worst was yet to come. She turned, wide-eyed, and saw a figure standing at the entrance of the hallway. Enrique was there. But it wasn't the Enrique she knew. It was a version of him, pale, with empty eyes and marked skin, as if he were slowly rotting. He smiled. And that smile was the last piece of humanity she saw on that face. A smile of something that was no longer him, but something that possessed him. Something that had been waiting for her since the moment she opened that damn door. The doorbell rang once more, but now, it wasn't the sound she feared most. It was the silence that followed. And that silence dragged on for long seconds, as if time had stopped. Carolina could no longer comprehend what was real. Her mind was completely shattered by Enrique's presence, by the certainty that he would never let her be at peace again. The phone rang again. But this time, the number was no longer his. It was her own number. Marcos told me that the phone never stopped ringing. And the most disturbing part was that Carolina answered the call. She didn't want to, but the pressure inside her mind pushed her toward it. She had to know. If what was happening was real, if it was really Enrique or something using his name to torment her. She answered the phone. The screen lit up. The number was her own. Fear paralyzed her even more. She stood still, unsure of what to do, but the voice on the other end finally broke the silence. "You didn't let me in." The voice was deep, muffled, as if it were coming from a dark cave, yet with a familiarity that made her stomach churn. Carolina didn't respond. She felt a knot in her throat, her breath failing in her attempt to stay calm. It was as if the phone was watching her, as if that number had become an extension of her own soul, a distorted reflection of herself. The doorbell rang again. But this time, there were no messages. There was nothing but the agonizing sound of the bell echoing throughout the apartment. The feeling that something else was there with her, something invisible, made her collapse to the floor. The phone slipped from her hands, falling onto the carpet. The environment was dark and cold, as if the air had become thicker, denser. She heard footsteps. Not the ordinary steps a human would make, but heavy, dragging steps, as if something was approaching, something with the intention of crushing her, of making her succumb. Each sound of a step seemed to pierce her flesh, making her feel unbearable pain. When she looked at the door of the room, she saw it, the dark shadow, large, a figure stretching up to the ceiling. It was Enrique, but it wasn't Enrique. It couldn't be. His eyes were black, lifeless, and his skin was in an advanced state of decomposition. He was there, standing, looking at her with a smile that resembled a threat. The voice from the phone echoed in her mind, as if it was screaming from inside her head, becoming a sharp cry, a sound that tore through reality. "You invited me, Carolina. Don't you remember?" She had no strength to speak. Terror was suffocating her. It was as if the air was being drained from her lungs, as if the world around her was being consumed by that horrible thing that was watching her. Every part of her body felt trapped, unable to move. And with each second, the feeling that death was approaching to devour her, slowly and painfully, took over. But she wasn't ready to die. She didn't want to believe that this was really happening. So with one last ounce of strength, she dragged herself to the phone that was still lying on the carpet. Her number was still on the screen. She picked it up, her hands sweaty and trembling, and answered again, unsure of what else to expect, feeling as if she might be hearing the echoes of hell. "Enrique, is that you?" The question came out slowly, as if it were the last thing she would say. "Yes." The voice was lower, more distorted, as if the thing on the other side was relishing her agony. "I am you now." That simple. "I am you now," was like a cold blade running down her spine. She felt a chill so intense that she could barely stand. The phone fell from her hand when the hallway light went out. The unbearable stench of decay filled the air, as if death had entered there in a tangible form and was crushing her. Carolina turned her head, and there he was again, Enrique, or what was left of him. But now, he wasn't just at the door. He was in every corner of the apartment, in all the shadows. Suddenly, the sound of crying filled the place. A cry that seemed to come from within the walls, from inside the very house, as if the house was crying along with her. And then, the walls began to move. Carolina tried to escape. She ran to the window, but couldn't open it. The walls were closing in around her, as if the house itself was swallowing her. The phone rang again, but she didn't want to answer. The sound of the bell began to blend with the noise of the walls, with the sound of crying, until everything turned into an unbearable tangle of sounds. She could no longer leave. She could no longer escape. Something had her trapped there, and each breath, each attempt to move, only brought her closer to what she knew was waiting for her. Enrique was no longer dead. And Carolina, well, she was no longer alive. Marcos told me that, days later, Carolina's body was found. But it wasn't the body he expected to find. What he saw was something he still can't explain to this day. She was lying on the apartment floor, her eyes open, but with an expression of pure terror on her face. Her hands were gripping the cell phone, and when they picked it up, it was still receiving a message. "I am already you." The worst part is that, after that, no one saw Carolina's body again. It disappeared. As if the apartment had swallowed everything, as if she had never existed. But her cell phone was found, with no explanation. And do you know what the last thing that appeared on the screen was? Who will be next? I don't know if you will believe it, but Marcos swore that every night he hears the sound of the bell ringing. And sometimes, Marcos's phone, somehow, also receives messages. And now, my phone has started to ring. Marcos didn't tell everything when he shared Carolina's story with me. He omitted what really happened to him, and what happened to me. What he told me, what he tried to avoid discussing, was the most terrible of all details. But now, after hearing my own story, you will understand. After Marcos recounted Carolina's disappearance, he was consumed by guilt. He couldn't forget what she had said the last time he saw her. I am already you now. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. For weeks, he tried to continue living normally, but something inside him was shattering. He said Carolina's presence haunted him. Then, one night, Marcos's phone rang. He was home alone, trying to finally rest, but the sound of the bell, from somewhere distant, echoed in his mind. He was about to pick up the cell phone to ignore the call, but he paused. Something made him hesitate. The number was private. The voice that came through on the other end was no longer human. I am in you. He tried to hang up, but he couldn't. The voice was heavy, as if it were coming from the depths of an abyss, and with every word, he felt an unbearable weight pressing on his chest. Silence engulfed the apartment. He looked around, expecting someone to walk in. But there was no one. The phone rang again. Once more, the number was private. This time, he answered without thinking. And there was the voice, but something had changed. It was not just the voice of Enrique or Carolina. It was his voice. His own voice, but distorted and grotesque. I am you. And now you are me. Marcos choked. Terror engulfed him like an unrelenting wave. He felt his heart racing. That was when the lights began to flicker, the phone screen suddenly lit up, and his name appeared on the display. But not just a name, also a message. I am inside you now. You will never be the same. It was then that he heard the doorbell. But it wasn't just that. The sound was closer, more real, more constant, until he started to notice a faint whisper coming from the direction of the door. He walked over, his feet heavy as if dragged, and looking through the peephole, he saw, not Enrique, not Carolina, but himself. The sight was inhuman, deformed, as if Marcos himself was trying to break free from inside someone else's body. The eyes were hollow, and the skin stretched and pulled, as if it were tearing apart. The doorbell kept ringing. Each chime was a beat in Marcos's heart. He tried to open the door, but he couldn't. Something was holding him back, an invisible force. His voice, or whatever was left of it, began to call out to him. I am you, and you cannot escape. The moment he finally managed to open the door, what he found was not his reflection. It was an emptiness that swallowed him whole. When he looked around, his apartment was in total darkness. He could no longer hear the doorbell or the voice. The silence was deafening. The streetlight illuminated a reflection in the window. When he turned, he saw something that couldn't be real. It was himself, standing there, with empty eyes and a twisted smile. And before he could scream, he felt a sharp pain pierce his chest. He fell to the ground, but no one heard his scream. The phone kept ringing, until, slowly, it stopped. When the last ring faded away, the number on the screen glowed. You didn't let me in. A few days later, Marcos's apartment was found empty. The only things that remained were his keys and the phone. But the phone, still with the screen lit, was sending messages to an unknown number. I am already you. And each night, with every doorbell ring, with every message received, someone, somewhere, began to hear the sound of the line ringing. The same sound of the doorbell. The sound of his own end. Did you like this story? Then don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel to not miss the next ones. If you've ever experienced something inexplicable or have a scary story to tell, send it to us via the email in the description. Who knows, your story might appear here? See you next time, if you're lucky enough to still be here.